I call her my daughter, and I mean that in every way that matters. If you think you know where this story ends up, I'm telling you right now, you don't. I'm 63 years old. I live in a two-bedroom house on the edge of Sudbury, Ontario, the kind of neighborhood where people still wave from their driveways, and the Tim Hortons on LaSalle is full by 6 in the morning. I've lived here for 31 years. I raised my daughter here. I shoveled this driveway alone through 30 winters, and I would do every single one of them again. My daughter's name is Ivy. She's 22 now. She was born with a rare chromosomal condition called Williams syndrome, a deletion on chromosome 7 that gives children a gift for music and language and warmth that can fill an entire room while making the practical, independent parts of life harder to navigate. She doesn't process numbers the way most people do. Contracts confuse her. Strangers can take advantage of her in 30 seconds flat if you're not paying attention. But she remembers every word of every song she's ever heard. She plays the piano by ear. She can name you the key of any piece of music in the first 3 notes. And she loves people with a ferocity that most adults spend their whole lives trying to find. Her mother left when Ivy was 4 years old. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because it's the fact that built everything that came after. My wife. I'll call her my ex-wife now, and I don't say that with bitterness, just accuracy. Sat across from me at our kitchen table one Thursday evening, the kind of ordinary Thursday that you never expect to remember, and told me she couldn't do it. She said she loved Ivy, but she hadn't signed up for this life. She said she needed something different. She was 31 years old, and she felt like she was disappearing. I remember looking at her hands, wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold, and thinking, say something. But I didn't. I just nodded. She moved out before the weekend. She moved to Vancouver 6 months later. A new partner, a new city, a new version of herself that didn't include the complications of a child with extra needs. I filed the paperwork. She signed the papers. She waived primary custody without a legal fight. For 18 years, I did not hear her name in this house. Ivy grew up knowing her mother had left. I didn't hide it from her or dress it up in language she couldn't understand. I told her the truth in the simplest way I could. Some people aren't able to stay, and that's about them, not about you. She nodded when I told her. She was 7. Then she asked if we could have pancakes for dinner, and I said yes, and that was that. I worked 30 years as a millwright at the Glencore plant outside the city. Early shifts, late shifts, weekend shifts, whatever they needed. I arranged my schedule around Ivy's school and her therapy appointments and her music lessons. I drove her to the conservatory every Saturday morning for 11 years. I sat in the waiting room while she played, and I could hear her through the wall. The music stopping and starting, her instructor's voice, and then something clean and uninterrupted that made the other parents in the waiting room look up from their phones. I was the man in the corner pretending to read a magazine, while his chest filled with something he didn't have a word for. When Ivy was 16, a man named Bruce Alderton from a small arts foundation in Toronto heard her play at a regional competition in Sault Ste. Marie. He approached me afterward. He said she had something he'd only encountered twice in his career. He asked if she'd be interested in a recording project, a small, curated album of original compositions she'd written herself. I told him I'd need to think about it. I also told him I'd need to see his credentials, his foundation's registered charitable status, and a full contract before Ivy signed anything. He blinked. I stared at him. He sent the paperwork the following week. That recording project changed everything. The album was called Morningside. It was released through a small independent Canadian label when Ivy was 17. It wasn't mainstream, no radio play, no promotional push, but it found its audience slowly, and then all at once, the way things do now. A clip of Ivy playing one of her originals was posted online by someone at the label, and it moved through the internet with that quiet, unstoppable momentum that nobody can manufacture. Within 8 months, the album had sold more than 40,000 copies digitally. Concert requests came in from small venues in Toronto, Ottawa, Halifax. A documentary filmmaker in Montreal called to ask about licensing her music for a project about Canadian artists with disabilities. By the time Ivy turned 19, her earnings from music, recordings, licensing, a handful of live performances, had passed $800,000, held in a trust that I had worked with a lawyer in Sudbury to structure carefully, specifically to protect her. Because I knew. I'd always known that Ivy's openness, her trust, her inability to detect the particular coldness behind a friendly face, those things made her vulnerable in ways she would never fully see. The trust had layers, trustees, oversight. It was built like a wall. Then, the spring Ivy turned 20. My phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the garage reorganizing a shelf of paint cans that didn't need reorganizing, because that's what I do when I can't sit still. The number was a Vancouver area code. I stared at it for a moment. Then I answered. Is this Ivy's father? I said yes. This is her mother. I set the paint can down. I didn't say anything. I know it's been a long time. I've been following her. Her music. I've been watching from a distance. I've been going through some things and I needed to hear her voice. I was wondering if I could speak with her. I told her I'd need to think about that. Of course, she said. Of course. I'm not trying to cause any problems. She's my daughter. I said I'd call her back. I hung up. I stood in the garage for a long time. I want to be clear about what I did next because it matters. I did not refuse to let Ivy know. Ivy was 20 years old. She had the right to make her own choices about who she wanted in her life. What I did was sit down with her at the same kitchen table where her mother had told me she was leaving 16 years earlier, and I told her exactly what had happened. I told her who had called. I told her why she had left and what the circumstances had been. I told her that the choice was entirely Ivy's and that I would support her either way. Ivy was quiet for a while. Then she said, "She left because of me, didn't she?" I said, "She left because of herself. You didn't do anything wrong. You never did anything wrong." Ivy nodded slowly. "Can I think about it?" I said of course she could. She thought about it for 3 weeks. Then she asked me to set up a call. The first conversation between Ivy and her mother lasted 40 minutes. I sat in the driveway in my truck and stared at the garage door. When Ivy came outside, she said it was okay, that they'd talked, that her mother had cried, that she used the word strange. Strange, but okay. Over the following 4 months, they spoke regularly. I stayed out of it. That was intentional. Whatever was growing between them was between them, and I wasn't going to poison it with my own history. But I watched. I paid attention the way I had always paid attention, and I noticed slowly that the calls were getting longer, that her mother was asking questions, careful questions about Ivy's work, her label, her management, her trust. One evening, Ivy mentioned casually that her mother had asked to see the structure of her financial arrangements. I kept my face neutral. I asked Ivy how she felt about that. She said she didn't know. She said her mother had explained she was dealing with some financial difficulties in Vancouver and was just curious about how things worked. Just curious. I called my lawyer the next morning. His name is Dennis Achterberg. He's been my lawyer for 19 years, and he's not a warm man, but he's thorough and he doesn't panic, which is what I needed. I told him what was happening. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Has she made any formal requests?" "Not yet," I said. "Then we wait and we document. Every call, every message, every conversation Ivy remembers. Start now." I started that same day. I kept a notebook, physical pen and paper, the old-fashioned kind, and every evening I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down what Ivy had told me about her conversations with her mother, dates, times, the specific questions her mother had asked. I'd been doing it for 6 weeks when the legal letter arrived. It came by registered mail to my address, addressed to me as Ivy's legal guardian, which I was not. Ivy was 21 by then. The letter was from a law firm in Vancouver. It stated that my ex-wife intended to apply to the Ontario courts to have herself appointed as a co-trustee of Ivy's financial trust, on the grounds that as Ivy's biological mother and a person with a legitimate parental interest, she had standing to ensure that Ivy's assets were being managed in Ivy's best interest, and that there were concerns, unspecified in the letter, about whether the current arrangements adequately protected a vulnerable adult. There it was. I sat with the letter in my hands for a while. I thought about the kitchen table, the cold tea, the driveway in the winter with the snow piling up against the truck, the 11 years of Saturday mornings at the conservatory, the notebook I'd been keeping for 6 weeks. I thought about Dennis Achterberg and his thorough, unfrightened way of moving through a problem. Then I folded the letter back into the envelope and I called him. "They've filed," I said. "Send it to me," he said. "And don't worry, we're ready." What I had not told anyone, not Dennis yet, not Ivy, not the few friends who knew any of this was happening, was that Ivy had been preparing for this too, in her own way. It had started 3 months earlier. Ivy had come to me one evening while I was watching the news and sat down beside me on the couch. She said, "Dad, can I show you something?" She had her laptop with her, and she opened a folder. Inside it was a document she had been creating on her own, slowly over weeks. It was a timeline. It was a meticulous, chronological record, dates, descriptions, her own words, of every conversation she remembered having with her mother since the first phone call. Every question her mother had asked about money. Every time the subject of fairness or access had come up. Ivy had included screenshots of text messages. She had written, in her own careful, looping handwriting, notes that she had then photographed and added to the folder. She looked at me with those big direct eyes she's always had and said, "I think she's trying to get my money, Dad. I knew it a while ago." I didn't say anything because I wanted to be sure. I looked at the document. I looked at her. "How long did this take you?" I said. "About 2 months," she said. I asked Miss Tremblay to help me organize it. Miss Tremblay was her caseworker at the community living office, a woman who had known Ivy for 6 years. I closed the laptop. I said, "You know you didn't have to do this alone." She said, "I know, but I wanted to." She thought I couldn't see what she was doing. I wanted to show that I could. That sentence stayed with me. I want to tell you it broke my heart in a particular way. Not a sad way, but the way a floodgate breaks. All that held back weight just coming through at once. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in early February in an Ontario court. My ex-wife appeared by video from Vancouver, which was permitted. Her lawyer argued that Ivy's condition made her vulnerable to influence and exploitation, and that given the size of the trust, it was in Ivy's interest to have a biological parent with formal oversight authority. The lawyer presented a carefully constructed portrait of a devoted mother who had made difficult choices, but who had never stopped loving her daughter and who now sought only to protect her. Dennis presented our response. He was measured and precise. He submitted Ivy's trust documents, which showed the existing protection structures in clear detail. He submitted my financial records from the past 18 years. He submitted the notebook, all 62 pages of it, properly exhibited. He submitted the timeline Ivy had built, which Dennis told the court had been prepared independently by Ivy herself, with organizational support from a registered caseworker. Then Ivy asked to speak. The judge asked her if she understood the nature of the proceedings. Ivy said she did. The judge asked her to describe, in her own words, her experience of the last several months. Ivy spoke for 11 minutes. She didn't use complicated legal language. She spoke in the way she always speaks. Directly, without performance, with that particular clarity that people with Williams syndrome sometimes have, where emotion and fact are not separate things but woven together. She described the phone calls, the questions about money, the shift in the conversations when she had started redirecting subjects away from her finances. She described the feeling of knowing slowly and then with certainty that she was being managed. She said, "I love music. I don't love money. But I know that other people love my money. I've met enough of them to know the difference. And I know the difference between someone who is asking about my trust because they care about me, and someone who is asking because they want something from it." She paused. She looked at the camera through which her mother was watching. She said, "I have a father who has been at every single one of my concerts, who drove me to piano lessons every Saturdays for 11 years, who stayed up with me when I was sick and scared and didn't understand what was happening. I don't need someone to protect me from him. I need someone to protect me from the people who show up when the money gets big enough to notice." The courtroom was very still. My ex-wife's lawyer asked to cross-examine Ivy. He asked if she was certain she hadn't been influenced in her perspective by her father. Ivy said, "My father told me the choice of speaking to my mother was mine entirely. He told me that 3 times. He didn't tell me what to say today. I wrote the things I said today in a notebook with Ms. Tremblay 2 months ago, and I can show you the dates on the files if you want." The lawyer did not ask any further questions. The application was dismissed. The judge's written reasons, which came 4 weeks later, noted that the existing trust structure was robust and appropriate, that there was no evidence of mismanagement or undue influence by the current trustee, and that the applicant had failed to demonstrate any legitimate basis for the proposed change in oversight. The reasons also noted, with language I read 3 times, that the subject of the trust had demonstrated a clear, independent understanding of her own circumstances and interests, and that her testimony had been credible, coherent, and compelling. My ex-wife's lawyer called Dennis the following week and indicated his client did not intend to appeal. That was 14 months ago. Ivy has a new album coming out this spring. It's called Porch Rail. She named it that because of something she told me after the hearing. Standing in the parking lot outside the courthouse in the February cold, both of us in our winter coats with our breath fogging in the air. She said, "You know what I kept thinking about in there? I kept thinking about our porch in the mornings. When you make your coffee, and you put the mug on the rail and you just stand there. I've painted that like 15 times. I said, I know, you never show me those ones. She grinned. Those ones are mine, she said. We went to the Tim Hortons on the way home, and we sat across from each other at a small table by the window with the gray February street outside, and we had our coffee, the way we always do. She talked about the new songs she was working on. I listened, the way I always listen. I don't know what happened to her mother after that. I genuinely don't. I stopped tracking the Vancouver number. What I know is what I've always known, which is that some people mistake stillness for weakness. They see a man who doesn't say much, and they think there's nothing underneath it. They see a girl who trusts people, and they think she can't see. They build their cases on those assumptions. They show up with lawyers and documents, and a story constructed to look like love. But love isn't a story you construct. Love is 62 pages in a notebook. Love is 11 years of Saturday mornings. Love is a mug on the porch railing that a 22-year-old woman has painted 15 times and kept every single one. I put my coffee down. I looked out the window. She was already talking about the bridge section in the third song on the new album, her hands moving the way they do when she's describing music, tracing shapes in the air above the table. I watched her hands. I thought, there is nothing in this world I would have done differently. Not one morning, not one drive, not one Saturday.